Hi, I'm Jeremy, the Zoo Nerd, coming to you live from my backyard in Los Angeles, California. A little later today because I've had some connection issues, so we'll try this again. Today in Critter Chat, we're going to talk about an amazing group of animals. Manatees are sometimes also called sea cows, and they are in the scientific order of classifying animals called Sirenia. In the Sirenia order of animals, there are three species of manatees. The West Indian manatee, which the manatees in Florida are part of that. There are subspecies called the Florida manatee. And then out in the Caribbean and along the coast of Mexico and Central America is a species called the Antillean manatee, also part of the West Indian species. And then in South America, in the rivers, there's the Amazonian manatee. These manatees live in freshwater and they're a bit smaller than their Caribbean cousins. And then across the Atlantic Ocean in Africa is the African manatee that lives along the African coast and in some of the rivers that come into the Atlantic Ocean. In addition to those three species of manatee, there are also a cousin species called a dugong. Dugongs live in the Indian Ocean along the other coast of Africa, up and around by the Middle East, along the southern Asian continent, so along India, parts of Southeast Asia, and mostly along the shores of Australia. In addition to that, there is an extinct member of this group of animals. That one was called the Steller sea cow. It differed quite a bit from the others in that it was absolutely huge. Steller sea cows have been extinct for about 250 years. They went extinct in the mid-1700s because they were hunted into extinction by people who were hunting them alongside hunting the sea otters. They lived in the North Pacific between Russia and what is now Alaska and down the Canadian coast a little bit. But they have been extinct for a very long time. They were a distant relative in this group of animals called Sirenia. Manatees and the dugong are large, fully aquatic herbivores. That means they're big, they always stay in the water, they don't come out on the shore, and they don't have any way to move on land. They have two front flippers and a big tail at the back, and that's it. So they don't have any way of moving on a beach, and they don't come out of the water. They're herbivores, which means they eat entirely plants. So that makes them a bit unique in that other large sea mammals eat a lot of shellfish or fish or tiny things like krill, things like whales, dolphins, sea otters. They are all carnivores. They all eat meat. But the manatees, they're vegetarians. They eat the seagrass, algae, things like kelp sometimes. That lives or grows very close to the shoreline. So you're not going to ever see them like out in the middle of the ocean very often. If you do, they're caught in a current or they're possibly migrating at a far distance, but they typically stay very close to the shore. They are also very slow moving. Their average speed is about 5 miles an hour, which as far as swimming in the ocean goes, that's not that slow. But it's certainly a lot slower than other marine animals. Things like dolphins and some of the whales are very, very fast. Same with sharks, which oddly enough, none of those animals really bother the manatees much. They have a very thick skin, and adult manatees really don't have predators. They can burst into a quicker speed if they need to get away from some sort of danger, or if they feel threatened. They can go about 15 miles an hour for a short distance. They also can hold their breath for a decent amount of time. If they're resting, if they're just kind of bobbing in the water or going down to rest near the seafloor, typically they can hold their breath for 15 to 20 minutes. If they're actively swimming or if they're eating, which they spend most of their time eating, they typically need to come up for air about every 5 minutes. They have very large, wide mouths with kind of prehensile or gripping lips that helps them to grab the seagrass and the algae. And they, like I said, they spend about half of their day, or about half of a 24-hour period, eating, grazing on the plants and algae that grow near the sea floor. So they have to be in shallow water where the sunlight can get down to grow the seaweed and seagrass that they eat. They also have a lot of bristles on the front of their face near their mouth, and those are very sensory oriented. They have a lot of nerve endings in them, kind of like whiskers on a cat. Those help them to kind of feel around in sometimes the murky water to find the plants that they may want to eat. Those bristles are called vibraceae, so they're kind of like the whiskers on a cat. Several other aquatic animals have those as well. One that I can think of are hippos, also have very sensitive whisker-like hairs on their face. Manatees have a really odd teeth pattern. They have new teeth always growing at the back of their mouth, and then as those grow in, they start to slowly move forward, and the worn down teeth that kind of are at the front get pushed out when they get really worn down. And that's important to them because they're always eating these plants that kind of slowly wear their teeth down, and so they always have a rotating set of new teeth coming in. They do make some sounds underwater. It's been documented that they make some little chirps, squeaks, and grunts, so they have a good sense of hearing, and they probably use those vocalizations to communicate with each other. They are largely solitary. You'll maybe see a mom or a baby together, except for when it's breeding time, then there's a lot together. Typically a lot of males kind of chasing one or two females, or if it gets really cold, a big group of manatees will gather in places where there's warm water. In Florida, that happens quite often during the winter months. They will gather in places where they're near either some hot springs or places where there's a power plant that is using water to help make power, and the water coming out from that is warm. And power plants actually have been a very helpful thing in sustaining the manatee population in Florida. Manatees can live pretty long, typically into their 50s and maybe 60s. There's some in zoos that have lived to be almost 70 years old, so they live a pretty long life, but they're pretty slow to reproduce. Their gestation is about a year, and then when the baby is born, it takes quite a while. It stays with its mom for 2 years or so, and during that time, she won't have another baby until the first baby's gone. And when the babies are born, they're already pretty big. They're about 60 to 70 pounds, and they are already 4 feet long at birth. The adults can be between 8 to 13 feet in length, and they typically weigh between 500 pounds up to about 1,300 pounds. So they are definitely very large. But the Amazon species, the species that lives in the Amazon River, is about half that size. They also, the African manatee and the West Indian manatee, they have little nails on the edge of their flippers because their bone structure is very similar to our hands. So they kind of have little fingers built into those flippers, and they have a little nail on the end of them. The manatees in the Amazon do not have the little nails, so that's one way you can tell them apart. Like I mentioned earlier, they do migrate to warmer waters. They typically need water at least 60 degrees warm for them to be happy and healthy, and they typically like it warmer than that. 60 is kind of the bare minimum temperature. Despite their size and their large bulk, they actually don't have a lot of like blubber or body fat to keep them warm, like things like a walrus or some of the seals and whales have. They also have a very slow metabolism, and they can't tolerate cold water very well. So that is sometimes a problem with them, especially as the fall weather turns into more cold weather during the winter time. And if there's a cold current in the ocean, that can cause big problems for them. I mentioned earlier today that manatees are probably the origin of the myth of the mermaid. Their scientific order name, Sirenia, actually comes from the Greek myth of the sirens. Sirens were mythical creatures who lived in the sea that would sing songs and lure sailors off their boats and then drown them. So they were kind of evil little creatures. And they think that manatees may have been a very possible origin for that, as well as the myth of the mermaid. They kind of have a human-like face, although if you're thinking a manatee is a very attractive mermaid, you might need to get your vision checked because they're a bit bulky and maybe not the prettiest or cutest of animals, although they're cute in their own way. One thing that's very interesting with manatees, and especially with the way their teeth move, that is similar to their closest relatives, which is quite surprising when most people learn this, but their closest relatives are actually elephants. Elephants and their closest relative, which are the hyrax, are the closest relatives to manatees. I'll talk about hyrax in a future episode of Critter Chat. They're really amazing animals, and it's amazing that they are the closest relative to elephants. So hyrax and elephants are in the same family, and they shared a common ancestor with the manatees about 50 million years ago. And manatees, they believe, evolved from land-dwelling animals that ate plants that then returned to the sea. But their bone structure and their teeth structure is very similar to elephants. Elephants also have teeth that grow in throughout their life and push out the older ones, although they don't necessarily move forward the way manatees' teeth do. Manatee species and their cousin species, the dugong that lives over by Australia and in the Indian Ocean, are all listed as vulnerable to extinction. They have several threats. In many parts of the world, they are hunted, although here in the United States, which they really only live kind of around Florida and up a little bit further beyond that, maybe to like Mississippi and Alabama on the Gulf side, and then up through Georgia and maybe the Carolinas on the east coast of the United States. Their main threat in the US is boat strikes. They get hit a lot by boats because they're often near the surface, and they're kind of a dark gray or brown color, so they sometimes blend in really well with the surface of the water, and it's sometimes tricky to see them if you're driving a boat. But legislation on boat speeds in areas that manatees use has helped out greatly in reducing some of that. In many places of the world, they are also hunted for either their hides or for meat. They are eaten by people in many places, especially in Africa and in some of the areas of Asia where the dugong lives. They're sometimes caught in fishing nets, and another big threat that is kind of on the rise is water pollution, specifically fertilizers and trash and stuff that gets in the ocean can have a negative impact on the ocean environment, and they can make it really acidic, or they can lead to something called red tide. Red tide is created by a very harmful red colored algae, and it can cause death in many different types of sea creatures when it happens. In 2013, around the coastline of Florida, there was a big red tide bloom, and it killed over 700 manatees that year. So it can be a very big problem, and it is largely caused by human pollutions that end up into the water, into the ocean. The Manatee Project in Florida is a huge conservation success story. Manatees were included in the very first endangered species list that started in 1966. So they were on there when the grizzly bear and the bald eagle and several other iconic species in America were first put on the endangered species list in the United States. At that time, it was estimated that there were only a couple hundred manatees in the US, and today there are over 6,500 of them. They were downgraded in 2017 in the United States to being threatened instead of being endangered. There's a lot of hard work that has gone into that, including putting up boat speed limit signs in areas where manatees live, and also a lot of community awareness and action to help people be cleaner and pollute less, to help prevent manatee deaths from things like red tide. Also, fishing industry has had a lot of new regulations, not new, but regulations put in place that have limited using fish nets close to shore, which have caused problems with manatees in many parts of the world. My experience with manatees is pretty limited. I've never worked at a place that's had manatees. I have seen manatees in several places, in several zoos and different aquariums. I know SeaWorld is a huge organization that is very involved in manatees, as well as most of the bigger zoos in Florida and 2 zoos in Ohio. The Cincinnati Zoo and the Columbus Zoo both are involved in what is called the Florida Manatee Project. That's an organization that is spearheaded by the United States Fish and Game, and they are responsible for trying to save the endangered species like the manatee. With that, when a manatee gets hit by a boat or injured or hurt or sick in some other way, it is often rescued and brought to a zoo or aquarium or a place like SeaWorld, where it is treated and watched and fed and carefully monitored, sometimes for years, until they are in a healthy enough position to go back to the wild. There are some that are unfortunately injured to the point that they cannot be returned to the wild, and some of those live to be companion animals in zoos and aquariums, which is especially important if they rescue a baby manatee that kind of needs to learn how to be a manatee. And in a lot of those zoos and aquariums have done a lot of amazing work, as well as our special shout out today, which is called the Save the Manatee Club, which is an organization that really has worked to gain a lot of community support in Florida and in the Caribbean on many of the islands there, to help raise awareness of the manatees and help people be a little more concerned and care about the manatees more. I'll share more about them and more information about manatees in general, as well as some interesting video on the Facebook profile for Zoo Nerd later on today, so watch for that. As always, feel free to like, share, follow, and subscribe to any of my content across the platforms of YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook, as well as on my website at jeremythezoonerd.com. Until next time, be happy, be healthy, have fun. We'll see you later.